Welcome back to another chilling episode of True Crime, Untold Cases. In 1902, a young boy's innocent morning of play along New York's East River turned into a nightmare when he discovered a barrel containing something that would expose a hidden criminal empire. What began with one gruesome discovery would spiral into a series of methodically planned murders, each victim found dismembered in barrels across the city's waterways. Before the Mafia ruled New York's underworld, another more secretive organization was sending messages written in blood, messages that would reveal a criminal society older and perhaps more terrifying than anything America had seen before. This is the story of the Long Island Barrel Mystery. Let's begin. In the crisp morning air of April 14th, 1902, young Louis Strife was playing along the East River near Oliver Street in Lower Manhattan when something caught his eye. A wooden barrel, partially submerged in the murky waters, had washed up against the shore. Like any curious 14-year-old boy, Louis approached the barrel, probably expecting to find something interesting inside. What he discovered would launch one of New York City's most notorious murder investigations and expose a criminal underworld that had been operating in silence for years. When Louis peered into the barrel, he saw something that would haunt him for the rest of his life: the dismembered torso of a man packed in sawdust and salt. The police were called immediately, and what they found was methodically gruesome. The victim's head, arms, and legs had been severed with surgical precision. The body parts had been carefully arranged, almost ritualistically, within the barrel. This wasn't a crime of passion or a hurried attempt to dispose of evidence. This was the work of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The barrel itself was ordinary enough, the kind commonly used to ship flour or other dry goods. But its contents told a story of calculated violence that would soon become all too familiar to New York's finest. The victim was a middle-aged man, likely of Italian descent, and his death had occurred within the previous 48 hours. The most striking detail was the method of dismemberment. Clean, precise cuts that suggested the killer had medical knowledge, or at the very least, significant experience with a butcher's trade. Detective Joseph Petrosino, one of New York's first Italian-American police officers, was assigned to the case. Petrosino was already making a name for himself as an expert in Italian criminal organizations, and his cultural understanding would prove invaluable in what was to come. He immediately recognized signs that this wasn't just another murder. It bore the hallmarks of something more organized, more sinister. The first challenge was identifying the victim. In 1902, fingerprinting was in its infancy, and DNA analysis was decades away. The police had to rely on more traditional methods: physical descriptions, missing persons reports, and most importantly, the cooperation of the local community. But when Petrosino began canvassing the Italian neighborhoods of Lower Manhattan, he encountered a wall of silence that would become the investigation's defining obstacle. The Italian immigrant community of New York at the turn of the century was largely closed off from the rest of the city. Years of discrimination and mistrust had created a parallel society where problems were handled internally, and cooperation with law enforcement was seen as betrayal. But Petrosino knew there was something more at play here. The silence wasn't just cultural, it was enforced. As the investigation continued, patterns began to emerge. The victim's clothes were of Italian manufacture, but relatively expensive. His hands showed no signs of manual labor, unusual for an immigrant in 1902. Most tellingly, several small businessmen in the Italian quarter suddenly became very busy whenever detectives approached, hurrying into back rooms or claiming they didn't speak English, despite having conducted business in English moments before. Then, just as the investigation seemed to be stalling, a second barrel was discovered. This time, it was found floating in the Hudson River near West 37th Street, exactly 2 weeks after the first. The method was identical: another dismembered body, another middle-aged Italian man, packed in the same mixture of sawdust and salt. The precision of the cuts matched the first victim perfectly, suggesting the same killer or killers were responsible. The press seized on the story, dubbing it the Barrel Murder Mystery. New York's newspapers filled their pages with lurid details and speculation about secret societies and ritual killings. While some of the reporting was sensationalized, the core theory, that these murders were connected to an organized criminal enterprise, aligned with Petrosino's growing suspicions. Through careful investigation and his connections within the Italian community, Petrosino began to piece together a disturbing picture. These weren't random killings or even traditional mafia hits. They were something older, something that had roots in the old country, but had adapted to thrive in America's largest city. The barrel murders were messages, warnings to those who might think of crossing a criminal organization that predated even the Sicilian Mafia. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A young Italian woman, speaking through an interpreter and terrified for her life, came forward with information about a group called the Black Hand. This wasn't the same as the mafia that would later dominate organized crime in America. This was something different, more primitive, but in many ways more terrifying. The Black Hand operated through extortion, sending threatening letters marked with a black handprint to businessmen and demanding protection money. But the barrel murders suggested they had evolved beyond simple extortion. The victims, the woman revealed, were connected to a network of counterfeiters who had tried to operate independently of the Black Hand's protection. Their deaths were meant to send a message to others who might consider doing the same. As Petrosino dug deeper, he discovered that the barrels themselves were part of the message. They came from specific warehouses controlled by Black Hand members, and their placement in the rivers wasn't random. They were left where other Italian immigrants would be sure to find them. The salt and sawdust weren't just practical preservation methods. They were signature elements meant to be recognized by those in the know. The investigation was now moving into dangerous territory. Petrosino had identified several potential suspects, all connected to legitimate businesses that served as fronts for Black Hand operations. But proving anything would be nearly impossible. The organization's structure was deliberately loose, with no clear hierarchy that could be dismantled. And anyone who might testify lived under the constant threat of becoming the next body in a barrel. The third barrel appeared in May, this time in the East River near the Brooklyn Bridge. The victim matched the same profile, but this time there was a difference. Clutched in the dead man's hand was a piece of paper with a black handprint. It was both a signature and a challenge to law enforcement. The Black Hand was declaring its power openly, confident that the police could do nothing to stop them. The discovery of the third barrel with its brazen message marked a turning point in the investigation. Petrosino knew he needed to change tactics. The traditional police approach of gathering evidence and witnesses clearly wouldn't work against an organization that had perfected the art of silence and intimidation long before arriving on American shores. Working with his superiors, Petrosino began developing a network of Italian informants who operated outside the usual neighborhoods. These were people who had nothing to lose: elderly immigrants with no family left to threaten, terminal patients in hospitals, and a few brave souls who had already lost loved ones to Black Hand violence. Through them, he started mapping the organization's structure, though the picture that emerged was far from clear. Unlike the hierarchical crime families that would later dominate New York, the Black Hand operated more like a franchise. Any criminal with enough nerve could claim to be part of the organization, sending threatening letters and demanding protection money. But behind these opportunists was a core group of leaders who maintained control through spectacular acts of violence, like the barrel murders. The investigation revealed that the dismemberments were carried out in a series of seemingly innocent locations: butcher shops, basement workshops, and even a small medical clinic in Little Italy. The killers would move between these sites, never using the same location twice. The barrels themselves came from a cooperage on the Lower East Side, where several workers were suspected of being Black Hand members, though none would talk. In June 1902, a potential breakthrough emerged when police arrested Giuseppe Morello, known in certain circles as the Clutch Hand, due to his deformed right hand. Morello ran a legitimate olive oil import business, but informants had connected him to both the counterfeiting operation and the barrel murders. However, his arrest revealed the frustrating limitations facing law enforcement. Despite hours of interrogation, including sessions conducted in Italian by Petrosino himself, Morello maintained his innocence with unwavering calm. More disturbing was what happened next. Within days of Morello's arrest, 3 potential witnesses against him met violent ends. One was found floating in the Hudson, minus his barrel. Another disappeared entirely, leaving behind only a letter to his family begging them to leave New York. The third died in what was officially ruled a cooking accident, though the investigating officers noted that the burns on his body seemed to follow a deliberate pattern. The message was clear. The Black Hand's reach extended even into the city's jails. Morello was released due to lack of evidence, but Petrosino had learned valuable information from the failed arrest. The organization's power didn't come from any single leader, but from its ability to inspire terror through theatrical violence. The barrel murders weren't just killings. They were performances designed to maintain control through fear. As summer turned to fall, the barrel murders ceased, but their impact on the city's Italian community deepened. The Black Hand had demonstrated its ability to kill with impunity, dispose of bodies in the most public manner possible, and silence any opposition. More importantly, they had shown that the police, even with Italian-American officers like Petrosino, were powerless to stop them. The investigation took another dark turn when investigators discovered connections between the Black Hand and several prominent Italian social clubs in the city. These establishments, which appeared to be innocent gathering places for immigrants, served as meeting points where Black Hand members could coordinate their activities while maintaining a veneer of respectability. More troubling was evidence that some of these clubs had connections to Italian-American police officers and local politicians. Petrosino found himself fighting not just organized crime, but a culture of corruption that had taken root in New York's institutions. The Black Hand's influence had spread beyond the Italian community, creating a network of compromised officials who were either on the payroll or too frightened to interfere. The barrel murders had served their purpose, demonstrating that the organization could operate openly without fear of consequences. The investigation's files grew thick with leads that went nowhere, witnesses who recanted, and evidence that mysteriously disappeared from police lockup. Each dead end reinforced the Black Hand's aura of invincibility. The barrels had become a symbol of their power, mentioned in whispered conversations throughout Little Italy. Parents used them to frighten misbehaving children, and shopkeepers paid their protection money without complaint, knowing what happened to those who resisted. By the end of 1902, the official investigation into the barrel murders had stalled, but its impact would be felt for decades. The case exposed the existence of a criminal underworld that operated by rules most Americans couldn't comprehend. It showed how traditional law enforcement methods were ineffective against organizations built on centuries-old codes of silence and revenge. Most importantly, it demonstrated the need for new approaches to fighting organized crime. For Petrosino, the barrel murder investigation became a personal crusade that would ultimately cost him his life. 7 years later, while conducting investigations in Sicily, he would be assassinated by killers who were never identified. But his work on the barrel murders had laid the groundwork for understanding how criminal organizations operated in America, and how they might eventually be confronted. The Black Hand's reign of terror would continue for years, eventually evolving into the more familiar Italian-American crime families. But the barrel murders of 1902 remained their most notorious legacy, a demonstration of how thoroughly they could control a community through calculated displays of violence. The barrels themselves became a dark legend in New York's history, a reminder of a time when the city's waterways regularly delivered gruesome messages from an underground society that operated by its own rules. The barrel murders' influence extended far beyond their immediate impact on New York's criminal landscape. They represented a turning point in American law enforcement's understanding of organized crime, forcing a recognition that traditional policing methods were inadequate against such sophisticated criminal enterprises. The investigation's failures would eventually lead to significant changes in how authorities approached organized crime. One of the most significant revelations came from studying the victims themselves. As police quietly continued their investigation through the rest of 1902 and into 1903, they began to understand that the murdered men weren't simply random targets or small-time criminals who had crossed the wrong people. Each victim had been carefully chosen to send specific messages to different segments of the Italian-American community. The first victim, they discovered, had been a successful merchant who had refused to pay protection money, believing his status in the community would shield him. The second was a former Black Hand member who had attempted to start his own criminal operation. The third, most dramatically displayed victim, had been an informal community mediator who had encouraged people to go to the police rather than pay extortion demands. Each death served as a carefully crafted lesson about the consequences of defying the organization's authority. The method of disposal itself, the barrels, took on new significance as investigators delved deeper into Italian criminal history. Similar tactics had been used in Naples and Sicily decades earlier, suggesting that the killers were drawing on established traditions of criminal intimidation. The barrels weren't just convenient disposal methods. They were part of a historical continuum of criminal messaging that dated back generations. Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery of how the Black Hand had infiltrated legitimate businesses throughout the city. The investigation revealed an intricate network of cooperatives, shipping companies, and warehouse operations that facilitated not just the barrel murders, but a whole range of criminal enterprises. These businesses provided both cover for illegal activities and the materials needed for the organization's signature disposal method. The investigation also exposed how the Black Hand differed from the mafia organizations that would later dominate organized crime. While the mafia operated with a strict hierarchical structure, the Black Hand was more fluid, more anarchic. This made it simultaneously harder to combat and ultimately less stable as a long-term criminal enterprise. The barrel murders represented both the peak of their power and the beginning of their eventual decline. By 1904, the specific perpetrators of the barrel murders remained free, but the investigation had fundamentally changed how law enforcement approached organized crime in America. Petrosino's work had demonstrated the need for dedicated units focusing on Italian criminal organizations, leading to the creation of the Italian Squad within the New York Police Department. This unit would become a model for specialized law enforcement teams targeting organized crime. The investigation's impact on the Italian-American community was complex and long-lasting. While the immediate effect was to strengthen the Black Hand's hold through fear, the brutality of the barrel murders eventually led to increased cooperation with law enforcement. Younger generation Italian Americans, born in the United States and less bound by old world traditions of silence, began to view the Black Hand as a threat to their community's progress and acceptance in American society. This generational shift would prove crucial in the eventual decline of the Black Hand. By the 1920s, while the barrel murders were still remembered with dread, the organization itself was losing ground to more modern criminal enterprises. The very brutality that had made them feared also made them vulnerable to changing times and attitudes. The Mafia, with its more business-like approach to crime, would prove better adapted to 20th century America. The legacy of the barrel murders extended beyond their immediate historical context. They became a symbol of how criminal organizations could control communities through fear, and how that control could be maintained with minimal actual violence once the message had been sent. The investigation's failures also demonstrated the need for law enforcement to understand the cultural contexts in which organized crime operated. Today, the barrel murders stand as a dark chapter in New York's history, but also as a turning point in America's understanding of organized crime. They marked the moment when law enforcement began to recognize that fighting criminal organizations required more than traditional police work. It needed cultural understanding, dedicated resources, and new investigative techniques. The waters of New York's rivers no longer yield such gruesome discoveries, but the lessons of the barrel murders remain relevant. They show how criminal organizations can exploit closed communities, how violence can be used as a form of communication, and how traditional law enforcement methods can fail when confronted with criminal enterprises built on centuries-old traditions of silence and intimidation. The case files remain in the New York Police Department's archives, a testament to one of the city's most notorious unsolved cases. While the specific killers were never brought to justice, the investigation they sparked helped create the modern understanding of organized crime and the tools needed to combat it. In this way, the barrel murders of 1902 marked both an end and a beginning, the last gasp of an old-world criminal tradition and the first steps toward modern law enforcement's response to organized crime in America.